Hello, everyone. This is Matt from Lost Tempo. And on today's podcast, we are blessed to have Meredith Lewis from Melbourne. And I think rather than me doing a long spiel, I will throw it over to Meredith. So, Meredith, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thank you, Matt, and I feel blessed to be here. And now, what do I want to be when I grow up? I describe myself as somebody who designs and facilitates beautiful conversations. Sometimes I describe myself as a professional listener. Um, I guess I'm a mixture. I'm an interdisciplinary practitioner, so I meld creative process mentoring, where I help people discover and express and build a creative process that suits their creative identities. I'm a creative non-fiction writer as well, but I'm also a facilitator, both offline and online. And my goal with my facilitation is to bring in creative techniques that allow people to really deep dive and have very deep and meaningful conversations, if I can use that cliche. Yeah, so I think that's me, I guess.
Fantastic. So, just to sort of maybe crystallize that a bit, can you give
Yep.
me an example? So, when you talk about beautiful conversations, what makes a conversation beautiful, Meredith?
Oh,
Give me an ex could you give me an example of a beautiful conversation?
yeah, that's the $64 question, and it does depend on who's in the room with you and what they need. But for me, for example, I did a conversation that I called the bewilderment game. And that grew out of actually the experience of lockdown, although I've used it since, because I could sense that people were grappling to deal with this very complex experience we were going through at the time and that we have been going through since. But I also believe in the power of storytelling. I think we're all creative. And one way in which humans are naturally creative is that we've all got imaginations and we are all innate storytellers. So in the bewilderment game, I set up a number of very simple, I say simple in that they were easily digestible and um, easy to engage with, but they were prompts that elicited the building of a narrative and a story in a fictional place. Um, so I would feed that to people. They would jot down ideas or sit and ruminate on ideas, and then at the end we would share things from people's stories if they wanted to. And I loved that conversation because people would sort of report in on where they were at and sort of tap into their own individual modes of creativity. Some people were storytellers and wanted to build fantastic and fictional worlds. Some people were anecdotalists and would bring forth memories and very meaningful memories. Interestingly enough, a couple of people went into an almost meditative space during that game and actually found themselves doing some creative problem solving. So they were all very different uses of creativity, but all very creative. And they all helped people to make sense of an experience they were having at the time and also gave people a framework where they could come together and talk and listen to each other's experience. So it gave people a chance to experience themselves as creative beings, as sense makers, as storytellers, as story hearers. But it also, for me, I tried to make it beautiful. Tried to bring forth beautiful quotations, imagery, metaphors, things that really tapped into people's imaginations, their emotional intelligence, as well as their intellects. So that's one example, but I've got lots of techniques. Sometimes I use visual prompts. Sometimes I play word games. Sometimes I don't do anything so fancy. I just come up with some good questions. And that can just fire people up. I did a session a few months ago about collaboration where I invited people to come in and talk about their experiences in collaboration. And all I had to do was ask one or two questions about that, very simple questions, but it really elicited a very rich conversation. It was one of those, and I'm sure you know, you've had this experience, Matthew, where you carefully design a workshop and you go in to deliver it. But if the workshop's designed the right way, you only have to trot out your first couple of prompts, and the conversation takes on a life of its own. And the group own the conversation and take it to where they need to take it. So, that's maybe just a couple of examples.
You're simply dropping some seeds into a fertile environment, or to use a different metaphor, you're simply dropping a few nourishing droplets of gasoline onto a roaring fire.
Yes, they're both. I do both. I can do both. It can be a little bit incendiary, perhaps, or a little bit generative. But again, it depends on who's in the room, the mood they are when they're in the room. I have a big bag of tricks, and I like to work with whoever the client is. But I really like those metaphors because it doesn't sound like I'm there telling people what to do. I am not a teacher, and teaching has its place, but it's not what I do. I really trust people's innate creativity. I trust their human need to make sense of things. I trust that most people are decent human beings with a decent amount of empathy and imagination and a willingness and need to connect. So all you need to do is give other human beings those little prompts, and then they will take them places where I never imagined they'd take them. And that's one of the joys for me of what I do. I love designing the conversations, and I love thinking up activities and techniques to use that are creative. And I've got a very strong imagination, so I can take that a long way. But I love that when I go into one of the conversations or workshops that I conduct, that I'm always surprised. People always do things that I can't imagine. And that's why I'm not overly fond of highly structured technique where I'm telling people, because why would I want to be limited by my own imagination when I get to talk to and listen to a whole heap of other cool people?
So, just kind of steering this in a slightly different direction. How did you get into this, Meredith? Where did you start from?
That's a really interesting question. I started from a lot of places. I've had one of those portfolio resumes, and I'm waggling my fingers in that inverted comma gesture as I say, one of those resumes. I have a mixed background. I started off in the arts and as a performer and a theatre maker, and that gave me instincts around and experience and around deep diving into story and building narrative, but also co-creation too, working with people on co-created things. I was an arts manager for a while, so I saw what happens when the raw imagination meets the practicalities of project management. I was in adult education, and that taught me how to facilitate and especially how to design and facilitate things for very varied stakeholders as well. I was in the community sector. I've done events management, and that's taught me about experience design. So I've drawn on all of those things. I still fervently believe in the innate creativity of human beings and their innate need to make sense of things and find connection with each other. I guess this comes out of some frustration when I used to work in the not-for-profit sector as a project manager. I used to, and as a manager at one stage, I found myself dealing with various committees or boards, and they should remain nameless, but where the group think was very limited. And I used to think surely we could have better conversations about complex things. We shouldn't be retreating into either the status quo stale thinking or retreating into defensiveness and hostility if we're challenged. And I sort of came out of that wanting to task myself with how do you lead people into better, deeper conversations where we can tap into the better parts of ourselves and find some connection. So it was really that desire that pushed me into facilitation. I mean, a lot of the jobs I did earlier in arts management, events management, volunteer management in the community sector saw me briefing people, training people, leading workshops anyway. Um, I just was really found myself drawing on all of that experience to come up with this presentation. I love the arts. I love creative content. It's something about myself. Of course, that was going to come in. I do believe that if you bring in creative content, you're invited is not just about their emotional intelligence and their imagination and conversation into something deeper. People will go beyond the surface script. So there's that. And I also mentioned lockdown to this. I lived alone at the time in lockdown, and I going online and connecting with people all over the world via Twitter and Zoom, also facilitators, but also tremendously creative in their practice, feeling impelled to make sense of a very complex moment. And really, really enjoyed and was inspired by a lot of the practice I saw there. So this is where I'm at. I want to have meaningful conversations with people. I want people to feel like they are creative sense makers in their lives. And I believe if it's beautiful and creative and evocative, a better conversation as a result.
So it's quite the journey you've been on.
Yes. Sorry, after all that
Now,
rambling, yes.
now let's sort of take things to the other end. So that's where things come from. Now, I think you've been in a fair bit of work around grief at the moment.
Mm,
So, which is almost about the end of something or the transition from one thing to another.
yeah.
So tell me a bit about that.
Yeah, that actually I'm going to pick up on your words just then, a transition one thing to another. I think because I feel like I am with myself and but with almost everybody else I know transitioning from one thing to another. I mean, we were shoved into really rapidly. And I will say, I want to make totally supported lockdown at the time when we were unvaccinated and nobody knew COVID. I was happy to do it, but it was a challenging experience. There were many, and it cost a lot of people. So there was a amount of grief. During lockdown, I was okay. I was okay keeping up my little practice, and I got a government subsidy, which I was very grateful for. But I could see ex-colleagues in the arts sector were really struggling. They weren't eligible for the subsidy, and they really struggled in terms of work and income, and really felt that their whole industries were shut down and they were facing a future. So I wrote something called The Next Day, which was and it was really about how to grieve a lost vocation. Do that many years ago when I gave up my early performing. I was a dancer once upon a time, and I had to give that up due to health problems. So I wanted to write to them and acknowledge what they were going through. Uh, just have some creative provocations around thinking about people to grieve when things end or even when things radically change. That actually got a really good response. I just bunged it out there on Twitter and said, here download it, but many people did, and I got beautiful feedback stating that right now because I've been frustrated ever since the end of lockdown. I don't perceive much of a conversation going on about what lockdown was like, how we've transitioned out of that, what we're transitioning to. It's as if pretending lockdown did not happen. And post lockdown, we are in this incredibly volatile world, for better or for worse. So things like coming out and disrupting all kinds of industries, for better and for worse. We have a very volatile political situation, the economy, climate change. There's so much change in people's lives. And I just really am interested in people alchemize loss, uh, change, unanticipated change, change that's imposed on them, how they can alchemize that and move on to making sense of it and finding a new way of entering their lives around something meaningful. I don't think grief is a bad thing. I think it's a very profound experience that we instinctually ourselves too, but we're not a grief literate society, so we don't have a language, we don't speak about it much. When we speak of grief, it is like it's that has to be cleared away, not an alchemical process that can help us grow and adjust. So I am very interested in the role of grief, and I think maybe I should use language more around alchemizing experience because talk about grief. But what I'm doing right now is updating the next book, and I'm looking forward to constructing some workshops around how to work with change, and alchemizing experience around change.
And so, without necessarily giving the game away, what are your what's your main approach to that going to be?
Sorry,
Sorry, without giving the game
what
away,
is my main? I didn't
what's
catch the last.
what's your main approach to that going to be?
Oh, it's very simple. I mean, I'm writing the ebook, and then on top of that, I'm going to base a series of workshops, and I'm going to use those creative techniques where people can come in, um, unpack their experience, and through creative prompts. I've got a number of them. Some of them, like I said, are visual prompts where people respond to imagery. Some of them are delving into words. I'm fascinated by the etymology of words. When you consider where a word has come from and its history, and how our ancestors might have used it, then it can unpack all kinds of things. But I'm also interested in mythology, in storytelling, um, yeah, and to just get people using that innate creativity that they have to have a deeper conversation. For example, this whole argument that seems to be raging and has been for some time about work for home good, work from office bad, or work from office good and work from home bad. I just don't understand why we're talking about it in such crude binaries. There's a more complex conversation to be had around people's connection to work, around the conditions under which they work, around their sense of agency. And I think by providing them with more creative frameworks, they can unpack some of those nuances more successfully.
Have we become allergic to nuance?
That's a great question. Uh, I'm not, but I think a lot of people are. I think a lot of people are. I was thinking just this morning, I was listening to a podcast about the state of Australian media at the moment, acknowledging there's a lot of awesome journalists and media outlets in Australia, but there's also certain media outlets that focus on driving a very binary, a very divisive, what's the word? Polarized, a very polarized conversation around things. And it doesn't help anybody. It just makes people, I think, feel very desperate. Um, so I wonder, I worry that we are a little allergic to nuance. I worry about whether or not people are capable of uh, thinking with complexity, and not regarding complexity as a bad thing, but maybe as a source of enrichment at times. It's not always there to complicate life. Sometimes it's there to enrich us. So, yeah, I wonder if we are a little allergic to nuance.
Oh, sorry, I think I was on mute there,
Ah,
which
right.
is a chronic modern condition. What what uh what I suppose what heals that nuance or reduces that nuance allergy? What encourages nuance to grow?
This is such an intriguing question. I'm really enjoying it. But do you know, I had the thought as I was talking just then that even though we might be allergic to nuance, in terms of how we perform in the material world, perhaps I think we still have, as human beings, I think we have a capability for nuance, or is capacity a better word? But I think just maybe it's latent, or it's not encouraged, or we don't have spaces in our everyday life. I'll call it our surface lives, where we can unpack nuance. We don't have the space or the time. But because I do believe that people are innately creative, innately imaginative, um, storytellers and story hearers, because we love that connection. And what is cool is that we are all of those things, but how people's creativity pops up is unique to each individual, which is very cool when you think about it. But because of that, we are capable of great nuance, because I don't think you can work with your natural imagination, or the stories you tell yourself in your own mind, without going into nuance. But I wonder if a lot of us aren't lacking in self-awareness or tools around reflexivity. And I think maybe some of us are lacking in that stuff because we don't get space or time to talk it through out loud with other people, and to discover and hear ourselves, hear the words out of our own mouths, that we are good at nuance. I mentor people around creative identity, and quite often they'll dash into an appointment and say, I want to write a book. I can't do it. I'm lazy. There's no nuance in that. And as we talk, and as they unpack for me their lives and what's going on for them, and why they don't think they can write their book, what surfaces is something very messy, but that's where the nuance lies as well. And it's my job not to tell them how to think or feel about writing their book, but it is my job to provide the space, carve out the space, and ask the right questions, and to be an empathetic and not non-judgmental listener. So as they talk to me, they hear the nuance coming out of their own mouths, and they start to say things, and they say, hold on, that's not quite right. They start to search for words. They start to search for the right framing of what they're trying to tell me. And as they do it, they often supply their own layers, their own sort of nuance around their own story. And at the end of our hour together, it's almost as if I'm seeing them hear the words that come out of their own mouths and their own, not just brains, but their own hearts. And they hear a part of themselves that they don't have time in their lives to hear. And they're hearing the nuance. So I believe we can do it, but I believe our life mitigates against us being nuanced beings.
I suppose nuance is is in one sense inversely proportional to busyness.
Yes, I think it may well be. Yes, especially performative busyness.
Yes, so busy,
Yes.
and therefore so important.
Yeah.
Okay, last question. So I'm interested in a time recently when you have been particularly energized or excited by the work you're doing. And if you could just sort of like tell us the story of that experience.
I think uh, let me see. There was one small example, but it meant the world to me. Somebody sent me a message. I conducted a session, and afterwards, one woman sent me a message, sent me some feedback, and she said, "Thank you for that session." She said, I'm very shy. I don't like group discussions, and I often don't volunteer. But I felt I could participate in yours because you made me feel safe. And just, that meant the world to me. That feels so important to me that I can go in as a facilitator and look, the techniques I take in, people often haven't experienced before. People see them as very innovative, sometimes very quirky, occasionally very eccentric. But it's so I'm asking people to do things they don't normally do. But it's incredibly important to me that people feel safe. I put a lot of thought into that in the way I design conversations because I want people to feel that they can volunteer the stories, the insights, the ideas that they want to, and also have the agency to not volunteer things if they don't feel comfortable. And for somebody to say, "You made me feel safe and you made me feel like contributing something that I usually don't," that meant the world to me.
Meredith, thank you so much.
Oh, look, my absolute pleasure. Thanks for having me on.